Oh man, it's been a long time coming. Those of you who have been paying attention to X and like the discourse going on there, you may have noticed that a lot of people are trying to damage control Iwata's legacy, right? The whole pay cut thing and how like Nintendo wasn't doing well for like a year, so like he had him and his executives take he and his executives all took a massive pay cut to avoid laying off people. And you may have like seen a handful of excuses for this, like, oh, the Japanese labor board is extremely strong, and they couldn't fire anybody. Hey, genius, they have employees in other parts of the world. Okay, they could have worked around that if they wanted to. Like, the reality is, Iwata and his board, and I think this continues today, are extremely responsible. Like, appropriate their budgets accordingly, and are run their business exceedingly well. Okay, like I read about this in Michael Crichton's Rising Sun, right? Which interestingly has been accused of being racist against the Japanese, but I always found it like very interesting in how like they kind of contextualize the whole American versus Japanese business relationships. But like the idea is that like Japanese executives expect their fortunes to rise and fall with the companies. So like yeah, they will take pay cuts. They will they will do that for the good of the company, right? It's not that unusual in more traditional Japanese business like culture, right? Like it's again, it speaks volumes as to how much this is why Japan has risen to be such a prominent force in the business world over the past 100 years. But like it's it's a very real thing, right? Like this wasn't like some conspiracy to try and make Iwata look good, right? That's been something that a lot of people have like speculated on is that like people are glamorizing him, and it's something that like he was forced to do it. Now it's just like the business culture, right? It's the company he cultivated. It's like it's everything he did, right? To do that. Um, And the thing is, I've been watching like a lot of these analysts, people like Daniel Ahmed, who's a real piece of shit, by the way. People like Benji Sales, absolute scum human beings, right? I actually have a tweet from Daniel Ahmed here. Yeah, it's about Activision Blizzard, right? Shintaro Furukawa makes 2.5 million a year compared to Bobby Kotick's like 155 million a year. And Daniel Ahmed like responds to it, being serious for a second. This is a perfect example of how Nintendo is able to allocate its resources appropriately. Rather than the CEO being paid an extra 152 million, the money can go towards what Nintendo has become known for, its lawsuits against gamers. Now, this is interesting because it does showcase what I've been saying a lot about these analysts for a long time, is that these guys are shills against Nintendo, right? Daniel Ahmed, Benji Sales, like Jeff Keighley, all these guys are always coming out like promoting every like anti-Nintendo product imaginable. Stuff like Power World, stuff like Baldur's Gate 3, every PlayStation IP under the sun, right? These guys are there. Daniel Ahmed was like that guy who tried to convince us that like, oh, Sony made more through PSN than they did than all of Nintendo has made this year, right? That was the guy behind that narrative. And what's happened since then? It's becoming more well known that Sony is in deep debt and that they aren't able to maintain their business, right? Look at the Destiny acquisition, right? They paid $1 billion for Bungie, have no way to pay it back, and what's more, the business is proving itself to be unprofitable, right? Like the cope and seething that people had that like, oh, Bungie's gonna help with PlayStation Network infrastructure, it's gonna be on par with Xbox Live, like that was nothing but a cope. Okay, that was a cope and a seed. That was damage control, which for something that everybody knew was a bad business move, right? It was a terrible move. I would argue worse than like Disney acquiring Star Wars. Like theoretically, if Disney acquired Star Wars and made like a bunch of good movies and managed to like keep the brand relevant, that would have been like a good acquisition for them. But no, instead they like ran the brand into the ground. But like with Destiny, like you didn't even have that. They didn't even last a couple of years before they started laying people off and having all these obvious problems. Like, all the expansions have been terrible, and like people are finally like even the hardcore player base are like turning on Destiny now. It's gotten so bad. and yet you're not admitting it at all, that like that acquisition was terrible for Sony. You're not admitting all the other terrible acquisitions they've had. The failure of PlayStation Now, the failure of PlayStation Portal, the failure of PlayStation 5. Like, you still don't see these people acknowledge that the PS5 has failed, even after Sony acknowledged that the console has like trailed way behind sales expectations. They've come out and said now that it's like in its sunset cycle, and like they went back on that. They tried to damage control it, but like, if you're paying attention, you know what's happening, right? Nintendo is exceedingly more well run than Sony is. The executives have a way better expectation as to what they deserve to be paid. They're willing to do whatever it takes to make their business successful. They're keeping people on board, they're training people up. Nintendo has like the highest retention rate of any company in Japan. It's something crazy, like 98.7 or something. And I imagine like a lot of the people that do leave are like going to studios like Platinum or whatever. There was that guy from NOE who like moved over to the Platinum Games, I think, to like try and like salvage the sinking ship or whatever. But like, you know, like, they work less than most Japanese companies. Like, they have a solid 40-hour work week. They have like all these great benefits. Like, and a lot of that was established by Iwata. A lot of that was established by Iwata's tenure at the company. And you're seeing these people. You are seeing them coming out trying to say, actually, Iwata wasn't that great. Oh, I had a lot of problems with Iwata. Oh man, he didn't understand Western gaming. No, like, Iwata was way ahead of the curve, way ahead of them. Right? He established the Nintendo Directs. He established like the Blue Ocean strategy. He established all these IPs. He funded niche stuff. Like, he was a great CEO. A great CEO. And yet you're seeing people like come out and try to say that like Nintendo is evil, right? Like they're Disney or some shit. Like, it is appalling how long this has gone on, and how desperately like the analysts try and like cling on to the narrative, because I do think this is true. Like, the instant that people realize that like Nintendo is better run than other companies, that it's more ethical than other companies, that like it produces better products than other companies, especially when it comes to hardware. I think at this point, like, everybody agrees the software is better, or at least it fulfills like a specific niche. But like, there's this very desperate like attempt at downplaying the whole like hardware being better thing. Like, the instant all that happens, right? The instant that people start realizing that like, Nintendo's actually pretty good, like, there will be no coming back for this. And you can see that in how the analysts treat the company. Like, film critics like try to write off the Mario movie, right? It's like the 15th highest grossing movie of all time or some shit, but like nobody paid it any mind, nobody gave it any attention. Like, they thought it was a one-time thing. But it's gonna kick off like, the NCU. It's gonna, the Zelda movie is probably gonna make more money considering it's live action. You know, like, we're seeing all this stuff happening. Like, the Switch is still dominating the gaming industry, even when every single analyst is like trying to say that like the Switch can't compete with like the PS5, the PC, and the Xbox Series X. Like, when in reality, like, none of those platforms are relevant, like, not a single one of them. And yet we're still seeing like the damage control. We're still seeing the coping. We're still seeing like all these people do everything in their power to try and like fool people into thinking Nintendo is some like malicious entity. And like just look at how they handled the whole Yuzu story, right? They were thrilled that like a company was like emulating Nintendo games, because they thought that it would lead to this glorious era where like everybody would just pirate Nintendo games on their PC or whatever, and people would just stop playing their Switches. But now it's safe to say that isn't going to happen. Ryujinx wasn't as successful as Yuzu, and it's probably going to get taken down as well at some point, right? Um, there was really like this concentrated effort to try to downplay Nintendo, and now going into 2024, seeing Gamergate 2 take off, seeing like people like lash out at the best Western video game sphere, like the game journalists, like in their like pitiful defenses against Sweet Baby Incorporated, and like those the developers that enable it, like it's not going to work much longer, right? Like it couldn't be more obvious to someone who has been watching the situation that Nintendo alone out of all these companies has remained completely pure. They have always put out good games. They have always managed to excel. They have always managed to succeed, and yet you're constantly seeing people bend over backwards trying to ignore and neglect it. Unicorn Overlord is more successful than people give it credit for, and Princess Peach Showtime is going to be more successful than people give it credit for. People are going to do everything they possibly can to ignore Nintendo successes in the business world, in the gaming space, and in all of their other ventures. Like, it is not going to stop until we put our feet down and refuse to take it seriously any longer.